So hello. I know you can't communicate with me at the moment, but yeah.
All right. So we are at 7:05. So with that, Dhaval, are you ready for us to get started? And if so, we can do. Okay.
Yeah.
All righty. So everyone, thank you. And we want to welcome Dhaval Panchal. He's an experienced executive. He's an agile coach and trainer, and an organization design consultant. He is the founder of Evolve Agility, a Texas-based coaching and training consultancy. He is Scrum Alliance certified enterprise coach. He's a certified Scrum trainer and a certified agile leadership educator. He works with leaders to create empowered work environments. He helps to amplify the scale and speed of agile transformations. Dhaval has led large-scale agile transformation for companies in oil, gas and energy, banking, insurance, gaming, and medical business domains. So Dhaval has more than 18 years of agile implementation, coaching, and transformation experience. So we are super excited to have him here. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Dhaval.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming to the talk. The topic is Introduction to Systems Thinking, and I'm doing this talk for the very first time. Part of it, the challenge with this talk is the enormity of the subject. To try to pull together something invariably means that I have to leave some more other important stuff out. So I hope I do justice to this topic. Let me start by sharing my screen so then you can also follow along. And in the chat window, I'm going to set up a link. This link is for a Google form that if you provide me with your email and some information like first name, last name, then I'll be able to send you a PDF of this particular talk, the presentation slides. You'll also participate in my newsletter, which I send something out every month, and you are free to unsubscribe at any point in time. So without further ado, I'm Dhaval Panchal, and here I want to share how to think in systems. And I think understanding how to think in systems is the key to unlocking the true potential for your organizations. And let me go into that before I go through some of these other information. So this is how you can get access to the slides. There's a link. That link is also in the chat window. And I'll be able to send the link out at the end of this talk again, in case you miss it. All right. So where do we begin? The topic of systems thinking is such a large topic. It's kind of hard to say, let's begin from some arbitrary starting point. So for me, I feel like in this particular section, where I want to go with is to first tap into your intuition, to first get a feel for developing some sense of recognition around what is a system. And we will build from that, because it's much easier to go that route rather than using vocabulary or terminology that is specific to systems thinking world. A collection is just that. It's a jar of jelly beans. It's a box of cookies. You take out one cookie, it does not affect the relationship of one cookie to another cookie. But a system, on the other hand, these parts must be arranged in a specific manner. And in that specific manner, when they are arranged, they carry out some purpose. Here in the image, you see the parts of a motorcycle. You can't arrange them in any random fashion and expect it to be a motorcycle. There is a specific order in which the parts need to be put together. And the relationship of these parts with other parts must have some specific design and purpose behind it, which lends itself to the larger purpose of it being a motorcycle, a system that runs on two wheels. We are familiar with systems like the circulatory system. You know, inside us, we have a heart that pumps blood throughout our bodies. And if you are exercising, your muscles and your body needs more nutrients, more oxygen, more air, and the heart reciprocates to your larger goals of being fit, of exercising, of working out. At the same time, there's also the respiratory system, where you have air coming in through your nose, getting into your lungs, and the circulatory system and the respiratory system, they interact with each other, transferring oxygen to your blood cells, so they can then carry it to the muscles that are working out. You can see how each system serves a very specific sub-purpose. The circulatory system is specifically focused on how well can I transfer blood with some viscosity, some liquidity through the whole of the body, whereas the respiratory system worries more about how do I do oxygenation, how do I transfer O2 and CO2 out of the body system, but they don't work in isolation. I'm not going to go into the digestive system, but the point that I'm trying to make is inside a larger system, there are subsystems. Each of these subsystems have their own purpose, but these subsystems are governed by the implicit or explicit goals of that larger system. It's the person at the end of the day and what they are aiming for, their habits, how they work, what they intend to do, that dictates how the subsystems within the person work to a large degree. To draw a parallel, think of an organization. Organization has subsystems like finance, the research and development department, production, HR, sales. These are all subsystems, and these subsystems cannot exist on their own. They need the larger system to build connections, transfer of information, some support that extends from other systems into a particular subsystem, which makes it possible for the whole to work together. This person, in turn, is part of another system, a family who's part of a bigger system, which is a community, part of an even larger system, a city, interfacing with another system, the rail lines interfacing into a much, much larger system, which is civilization as we know it today. In other words, to look at systems thinking, it is very, very daunting because these systems are nested within other systems and they all function to their own whim and fancy, but also towards the larger goal of the system that controls or has a domain over the smaller one. One of the key points that I want to build as an intuitive understanding is in the Newtonian world view, there is a cause and there is an effect. And whereas in the real world, the same effect has multiple causes. In fact, it could be a set of causes working in a particular manner that leads to an effect. And each of these causes are not isolated in their creation of an effect. They also create other effects. So this network of cause and effect and the chain that connects causes to effects and so on and so forth can be quite elaborate. So a system essentially resides within this chain of cause and effects where no single cause is independently responsible for an effect and no effect is independently caused by only one particular cause. There are multiple causes, there are multiple effects. And we recognize a system because that system has relationships both within the boundary and outside of it. The thing to realize is when you pull on one thing in the larger universe, you're going to unravel a chain of cause and effects that could lead you to a whole set of other things. And the last key point about systems, the systems, they come and go. They grow and they collapse. I'm showing this image of the civilization over the multiple thousands of years just as a representative. I haven't verified this for accuracy or truth. But this is quite familiar, you know, we see regimes come and go. We see different ways of doing work come and go. And it is in the nature of the systems to grow and collapse and become something else after that. With this kind of an initial overview of what systems are and the scope at which systems thinking tries to play, I want to kind of go into the core fundamental building blocks of systems thinking And then we'll use that in the context of our work in the Agile space as a way to understand how you might apply systems thinking inside our realm of Agile transformations or coaching or leading organizations. A key concept in systems thinking is about feedback. This feedback is nothing but an exchange of information. And once we receive feedback, our response can be a reflex. If I put my hand on a very hot plate, I'm going to instinctively just pull my hand back, because that's how my body has learned over the millennia, right? I'm not that old, but biologically there is learnings that we have accumulated, and now they're ingrained as reflexes in what we are. To taking a reaction. I might encounter a particular event, and my feedback that I receive based on that event could be an immediate reaction to whatever is happening, or I could respond to it in a timely manner, or perhaps I can mull over it and then delay my response. So the thing about feedback is there is always feedback coming from the system. Now, how fine-tuned your sensitivity is to that degree of feedback matters, and how you respond to that feedback also matters. Reinforcing, or a dynamic where the more you have, the more you get, also known as the snowball effect. If you have done some elementary math in high school, you would understand how compound interest works, where the more principal you have, the more interest you get, and the more interest you get, the greater your principal becomes. This reinforcing pattern, or a system where things accumulate or accelerate, leads to growths or collapses. When you apply some kind of impact to it, these cycles could be virtuous cycles or vicious cycles. And they are one of the key dynamic patterns that occur when you try to understand what is happening at the systems level. Another dynamic that you encounter is that of balancing, where when one goes up, the other goes down. Your at-home temperature control thermostat works like that. When the temperature reaches the goal temperature, say it is 80 degrees outside and you've set it up to 68, when your air conditioner gets the temperature to 68, it stops pumping in cold air. It lets the temperature to slightly rise, and then again kicks back the air conditioner to bring it back to the goal temperature. We see the same dynamic in the predator-prey cycle. When the number of predators go up in the jungle, the number of prey go down, which causes the number of predators to go down, because there's not much food for them, and that increases the amount of deer in an ecosystem. Balancing effects tend to have stability or stubbornness. It really speaks about the goals that the overall system has. And oftentimes you see systems that are in the status quo, comfortable or not, but in the status quo, they are experiencing a very strong balancing dynamic. The fourth concept, that is, I think, one of the key building blocks, is understanding leverage. And I think Archimedes said, like, give me a lever long enough and a place to put it, and I will move the world. See, the notion of leverage is very appealing, especially for leaders, because once you understand the system, you can truly make a very small change in one small area of the system and get significant movement in other parts of the system. What we do when we are working with leverage is we are impacting the relationship between the system parts. You're altering those relationships to have a much greater impact on the overall system. In systems thinking world, we tend to talk about the iceberg of systems thinking. And a way to understand this is to look at it at three layers. The layer that is visible is the layer of events. These are facts that are presented or as perceived or as witnessed by you or people. Then there are behaviors or patterns, trends or changes in events over time. And lastly, there's a structure, which is inherently invisible because it is formed out of the relationship that the pods experience with other pods. And it cannot be detected through observation, but you can detect the presence of an organization structure or a system structure by the evidence that it leaves behind. I know this can get a little confusing, so we are going to go a little bit more into practical examples. But before we go there, you can consider this as events being things that you hear on the news. This thing happened, that thing happened, and these are facts as presented by the journalists, and you interpret them the way you want to interpret them. And then you see some patterns or things emerge if you're paying attention over time to a particular space. But what we never get to see is the structure that is driving these events and these patterns to occur. And the art of systems thinking lies in trying to grasp at what is that internal structure as best as you can. Let's take an example. At an event level, let's say there is a fire in the building. The fire department will respond immediately. The fire department has a goal to douse or eliminate fires, and timeliness is an important metric or measure that they are evaluating themselves against. How quickly can we get to the scene of fire and remove the fire? Now, at the event level, this reaction of the fire department is very reactive. When there is a fire, you must run with the engines blazing and the sirens on to make sure that you take care of the fire. But over time, if you notice that there is a pattern, that is where you see a lot of fires happening in one area of the neighborhood, then you could respond at the pattern level by saying, let's establish a fire station because there tends to be a lot many fires in this particular district or this area of the town. The structural understanding will require that you go beyond just the immediate event of a fire or a pattern of events where there are many fires in the neighborhood. Understanding the structure would involve asking questions like, why are there more fires in this particular neighborhood? What can be done to prevent future fires? In answers to those questions, you understand how the events and the patterns are emerging. And to get into that space, you have to get creative. I mean, there are no canned responses. There is no generic response to why this particular neighborhood has more fires than other particular neighborhoods. There may be some meta patterns that emerge out of your learning, but you really have to tackle that specific problem. And that's where the creativity of the person or people who are working at the systems level becomes crucial. Understanding systems at play. Now that we've covered a set of core concepts about what systems are, as a reminder, the key things that we talked about in terms of understanding the key building blocks for systems are: one, feedback. Do I even acknowledge there is feedback? And if I do, how do I respond? Do I react? Do I reply? Do I think through it and then I respond to it? There's a whole lot of things that go with feedback and how we respond to feedback. Two basic system dynamics: one, that of a reinforcing loop, and that of a balancing loop. And lastly, the notion of leverage. All of these four topic areas combined within the space of, or the mental model of using the iceberg as a metaphor for surface level events that may reveal a pattern, but will always hide the structure within. Let's look at how we can use that thinking to understand some systems at play. And what I want to do is I want to share some techniques that I use in my coaching engagements that I consider come from this school of thought around systems thinking, and how that could help the people or the teams or the leaders who are in these organizations to think differently for the same problem. So I'll introduce a concept, then we'll review an example. That way you get a good grasp on what that example is and how that concept might apply. There's an activity called containers and exchanges, and the best a way to understand a container is something that holds the boundary for a system. So if, for example, a container is a family. There's a mom, dad, children, dogs, that's a family. That container does not mean that this family is isolated on an island. It just means that we recognize this unit, family, as a unit, which is separate than the individual, then the school, then the neighborhood. And you can think of a container as a rough grouping that allows a group of people to associate with each other. These containers exchange something with other containers. And in organizations, this could be as simple as a Scrum team A exchanges status reports with a committee B. Yeah. So these people are in some kind of a system which has a perceivable boundary. And across those boundaries, these containers are exchanging information. They're exchanging something. So what we want to do to understand what is truly going on at the system level is map out these containers and exchanges that are happening between these different containers. Let's take this as an example. In this particular example, what you are seeing on the right-hand side is at the center is Ed. Ed is a product owner, and he does not have enough time to attend to refinement and planning sessions. So taking this activity of containers and exchanges, what we did was we said, okay, Ed, let's look at your calendar and look at all the people and committees or groups that you have interacted with over the last month. It was a 15-minute activity. Very quickly, we found out that the product owner has more than 16 meetings to update status and coordinate with other people. There are quite a few committees in this very large organization. They are all concerned about the most important project being led by the product owner, so they are requesting reports in their preferred reporting format. So as a consequence, you can imagine that the product owner is spending quite a lot of time massaging the same information to different formats so different committees can feel assured that the project is going well. Well, this pattern is quite common for a structure where the Agile team works within a traditional IT organization, which is managed by the PMO office. So if you now look at this problem at the surface level, it could seem like, oh, the product owner doesn't have time to attend our Scrum meetings. But if you dig a little deeper, then you can see why this is happening, what's the pattern, and then what's the structure that is driving this particular behavior. As an intervention from a leadership standpoint, I can intervene at different levels. I can intervene at the event level. I can be reactive. As a product owner, I could decide to attend my Scrum team meetings whenever I can get away from my other meetings. And that's a very reactive response to overload with the meetings in my organization. I could work at the pattern level in the system and offer a more adaptive response. I could sit with my team and say, okay, let's look at all the meetings, which day and which time seems to be more open, and let's book that time for the rest of the year. So other people do not block my time. And now I have carved out a specific time to work with my team. And it's a very, very adaptive response to the context and the environment in which this product owner finds themselves. A creative response, and this creativity comes when you acknowledge the larger system at play, and there is no one right answer. Yeah. In this particular example, I found it to be very creative, where the product owner, knowing that they are working in a larger PMO style traditional organization, asked for help and got a project manager whose primary role was to attend all of these superfluous meetings and provide reports to different people in different formats so that the product owner could truly be free to work with the team. And this response, I do not want to imply whether it was a good response or a bad response. It was a creative response to the situation, an experiment that could yield more information than simply being reactive to whatever events that are happening in this team's context. Another technique that comes from systems thinking is to look at how stocks and flows what they mean by stocks and flows is where do things accumulate, how do things progress, and where are the reservoirs of intermediate steps. In our agile terminology, we would consider backlogs as our stocks. Yeah. So if you have backlogs or queues that are serialized, you will experience a wait period. And it is quite common to see this in many organizations where a project might be commissioned or initiated or desired at the start of the year, say January 2021. Then it will go into a group that is responsible for market validation. It'll sit in the queue and they'll get to it by March, do their value added work and say, yep, let's do it by the end of March. By the time this initiative sees some contact with the customer, it could be well over a year. And the actual time that people worked on it could be significantly low, because a majority of the time, these items are waiting in the backlog, waiting for the next person to work on. And that's the fundamental challenge with serialized backlogs is anytime you introduce two queues or backlogs in a serial manner, you must plan for the wait period. It's sort of like structurally, that's how it works. On the other hand, if you have backlogs that are parallel, in other words, people are working on all of the items all of the time, then you can also end up in a dynamic where what the end user wants, and we see this a lot with component teams, right? Where you have a UI team, a middle tier team, a data platform team, and they're all busy 100% working out. But what is lacking is a coherent product because the user has only the SQL query in one feature, whereas in the other feature, they have the front end and the other parts are missing. The way we cope with these problems in the world of parallel backlogs is by creating dependencies and items that get added to other people's backlog. So if you look at this, what is really happening is one end user has a single need that gets broken up into at least 3 backlog items plus 2 or 3 dependency management items. So in other words, when you have parallel backlogs, you should expect a few things. The number of backlog items will explode by a factor of 4 or 5. It will also result in people working in parts of the system that require special coordination or coordinators to make sure this all works, that you can provide something of value to your customer. Okay, so this is like the core understanding of serialized backlogs versus parallel backlogs. How might we apply it in our organization? One of the key things that I try to do with a family of teams, or when I'm working with the product area, is I try to collect how many backlogs exist. And this is for one organization where the concern was that stakeholders are getting extremely impatient. They are escalating a lot, or they are directly going to their favorite developers and asking for work to be done. And the product owner finds themselves defending their priorities and trying to support the team, and it's increasingly challenging. So what we said was, let's just go talk to the stakeholders, and among other things, let's identify the sources of work. And what we discovered that each group had their own favorite tool. Some groups used Excel files, others were familiar with Jira. There were some other groups that used emails or Slack messages, and the variety is just amazing. Like, there's so many things that people use as their sources of backlogs. So we got people in a session to understand where are all of these backlog items coming from. What are the relationship between these backlogs? There could be a merchandising group that is creating items for the marketing group, who then creates an item for the sales group, who then ultimately creates an item for the user experience group, which ultimately comes to the Scrum team to now implement as a feature. The structure that we noticed was there were 11 backlogs that were generating new items, and there were only 6 or 5 backlogs that were aggregating or accumulating items. So this kind of a system is going to only reward stakeholders who escalate, because here, if you don't escalate, if you cannot chirp above the chirp of the other stakeholders, you will not be heard. And in this kind of a system, what we find is you could take a event-based response. The event-based response or the reactive response could be for the product owner to do their best, to keep ahead of the stakeholder needs and leave some free capacity each sprint. So whenever there is an emergency from a stakeholder that takes you out by a surprise, you have some availability to cope with this. An adaptive response that I see could be possible here is you do what the SAFe people call as the big room planning. You get everybody in a room, settle on the priority, agree on a prioritized backlog, get the teams to say, yep, this is feasible. And as a result, take away the adaptability of the whole group, right? Even though this response is an adaptive pattern response, it is quite opposite of doing Agile, in my opinion. So, but it's a legitimate response. When you have a large group of people who can't find agreement, you fix the time horizon and you ask everyone to come together and get their priorities sorted with everybody else. It is a valid adaptive response. A more creative response to this particular pattern or system could be to look at and define what your product is. Maybe set a product goal and do what it takes to start merging the items towards a single product backlog, merge as many of the 16 backlogs to get closer and closer to a single backlog. Because only the reduction in number of backlogs is truly going to give you the benefit that you seek from Agile. And this is where the systems thinking informs or Q theory informs us that what you don't want to do is to fall into the reactive trap or assume that managing stakeholder expectations in quarterly increments is going to help. It's much better to have a more creative. It's much better to address the relationship between the people who are responsible for the structure as it stands today. What can be done between the relationship of sales and marketing, so they don't maintain multiple backlogs, but actually come forward with a coherent feature idea for the product team to work on. I mean, these are challenges that are not easy to resolve. They require roll up the sleeves, hands on ground type work from people who are deeply sensitive to what is happening in that system. We can't superimpose agile techniques like big room planning or commonly used patterns to get a lasting impact to these problems, because they will keep coming back. Another key characteristic of systems thinking is the willingness and the ability of people who are participating in systems thinking to engage in a dialogue. And the technique of causal loop diagrams is quite helpful in generating and sustaining dialogue over multiple days. Here, I'm describing a very common archetype called fixes that fail. Yeah, the way to read this diagram is, as the problem increases, the amount of fix that you apply also increases, which reduces the problem or the challenges with the problem in the short term. But in the long term, because there is a delay, unintended consequences kick in, which make the problem even bigger than they were before. The nomenclature and the way you arrive at drawing your own systems is fairly academic, and it's easy to learn. So I'm not going to go into the details of it. But what I'm going to share is, it is important that as an organization, as a team, as a department, whatever your container is, where your scope of change or work is involved, you have to take the time to model your system and understand what's going on in your system collectively. And you do that to hold a dialogue with your people in how this impacts the decisions that we are making at the leadership level, how this impacts the people who are actually doing the work. And that dialogue needs to happen across the board. It cannot be siloed in just one functional group of the organization. When you look at this from the standpoint of an event, the organization has decided to transform to being agile, and a reactive response would be to send everybody to a 2-day training and conduct more trainings until there is no more budget left. The overall pattern that we see now is agile has proven, and I'm saying it in quotes mainly because I don't even know what it means to be a tried and true or proven approach, and there are quite a lot of literature out there that, in my opinion, sets false expectations from agile. And what we find in the larger industry is people more and more want to work in an environment where they truly are engaged and they have the ability to exercise autonomy. And that also means that employers are more and more looking for people who are independent and can take ownership of their own work. This whole structural dynamic is creating more and more need for what we now say is agile, but what we are really asking for is autonomy in how we work, and also a say in the overall direction of the products and services that our companies provide. I don't think sending everyone to training will help. Launching teams and rolling waves and all of these other patterns are essentially an adaptive response to this pattern of, we have a very large organization to transform, so what can we do? What we don't do often is get creative. What we don't do is engage the leaders to join the conversation and understanding how the system works. We don't take the time to understand how we got here in the first place before we design experiments to essentially shift the goal of the system to be adaptive. Because a key thing about any system is it wants to attain some goal. Now, whether that goal is explicitly expressed by the people in the system, or it is the implicit goal of the system. And intermediate interventions at the event level or the pattern level only distract the system, because as soon as those interventions are taken off, the system will again find its balance back to its original goal. So what is really needed is shifting of the goal of the organization, of the system that you're working at. And it can't shift without participation of the people who form that system. One of the challenges that happens when you're working in organizations, when there are more than one people and the problems are more complex, is we don't get to see the totality of the problem. We get to see what we can perceive. This short story about 7 blind men encountering an elephant interact with the elephant in their own local space and form a judgment that is based on their personal interpretation and experience. But because they don't know that everybody else is also looking at the same thing, they cannot agree that it's the elephant, you see. Similarly, what systems thinking helps us do is helps us to understand the elephant as best as we can, because in teams, in groups, there are challenges, and these challenges can be perceived by people as different challenges. What could be a great day for you might have meant that your colleague had to stay back in order to make up for all the buggy code that you checked in. So there are always in systems some people who might be paying an unfair price to cope with the overall system and the way how it works. And oftentimes people don't see the whole problem. And it's far more complicated than even this, because the dance floor is made up of these players who have their own identity. They have their habits, their competence, what they need, what they fear, what they value. They're working with these other people in a group, which is called a team, that has its own mission, processes, domain, some constraints under a much larger system, which is your organization, which has its own processes and culture and history. And this is so complicated that it is impossible for any person to fully understand the structure of the system. But what you can do is understand it just enough to have a dialogue with the people that are interested in making a change and design a short intervention. And what that means is you have to be willing to enjoy the dance. Leading within the organizational context, you are going to come across a variety of systems. In fact, one of the key things that I like to do as I coach teams is I would ask them to go through a cycle in a very short time. So maybe practice, if they are practicing Scrum in 2 days, and do that 3 or 4 times. That's just primarily so they get into the habit or the conditioning of what these events are and how you get to the essence of it in a very short amount of time. But then we observe the team in its context for 2 to 3 months. And it is always interesting to see how the moment you introduce a change within the system, some of the other subsystems dial their interest down, but after some time they will dial back up again, and you start seeing stakeholders going back to their favorite developers, everyone going around the product owner to get work done. In other words, when you're playing with the system, you have to give it time to understand how the system really reacts. This is different than how the stakeholders were trained and how the stakeholders agreed in a working agreement session that we will go through the product owner. But in reality, they don't. And that itself is a revealing fact about the system. So you have to be willing to play this dance and see where it goes. The core purpose, when you're looking at engaging in a dialogue and building a shared vision of where you want to go, I would say avoid telling people that this is how our organization is going to be way better if we do X, and avoid selling people into Agile or anything else. If you truly want to have buy-in from the people who are part of the system, and this goes across the board from your directors or execs to the team member to an intern, is you want to engage them in the co-creation of where we all need to go. And it's an often overlooked part, because we assume that because the super leader has made a decision to do X, everybody is willing to do X. And in that, we lose out on getting feedback from the people who are expected to go through the change, getting their buy-in and interest of why this change is important to them, or what could be done differently to make this change better for them. And in that consultation, testing of ideas is where we co-create and arrive at a shared vision that the whole group can get behind. And there is tremendous power in this, because a system has a variety of leverage points, and the least effective of which is using metrics and targets and numbers. The most effective is the mindset out of which the system arrives. So why not tell stories? Why not engage in a conversation? Why not spend the time to understand how our system is working currently? What does it do well? What does it not do well? Why not take that time to truly make a mindset shift, as opposed to looking for ready-made answers provided by someone else in a hypothetical scenario, or maybe in a scenario that worked for them in their organization, but may or may not work in your system. This 12 points of system leverage comes from an excellent essay by Donella Meadows. I've used the same leverage points to compare and contrast in a different talk that was recorded as a webinar, so I won't go into the details of that. But primarily what I see is managers and leaders focus a lot on setting numbers and targets and some parameters as a way to assess whether we are getting agile or we're getting better. Instead, if they focus a lot more on the mindset and the worldview from which the current system arrived and how it needs to change, they would get a much better shift in the system. Of course, it's going to take a lot harder. It's going to be harder than just setting a velocity target for a team. It will be harder to sit down with the team to ask how they came about to be where they are. What do they want to do as a team? What do they see their purposes in building the product and services? For a leader to do all of that takes time and energy, but that has way more impact than just sending an email to say to the team, double your velocity. I mean, that actually backfires miserably. So when you think about making any change in the system, don't rush to the easily accessible levers of measures and metrics. Instead, focus on how can we get closer and closer to making feedback more compelling? How can we get closer to building some kind of renewal or change in the rules and the policies of the system in which it works? Like, these are all far more powerful than setting numeric or any other targets for the org. We all have confirmation bias. You know, we tend to cherry pick information, and things that confirm with our beliefs is what we see. And then there is the realm of objective facts. You know, sometimes we are conditioned to think in a certain way, and that's just the way it is. Sometimes it's an ideological bias that we carry. Either way, is like, you know, these things can be emotionally charged. So where I want you to take this information that I've shared with you, right? And some of it could concur with the way you think. Other times you may not agree with what I'm saying, and that's okay. I'd like you to pay more attention to the questions you ask. Don't worry about the answers you get, because it's in the questions that you ask that you will learn where your focus is. You need to go beyond just event level responses. You want to go beyond what happened to where else can it happen, to why does it happen. And getting to these lower and deeper levels of understanding and asking different questions is only going to help you to truly build a good sense of the system at play. We often believe that you could ask people to change their actions and the results will happen. And that's often the realm of management or managers. You know, they'll describe, in order to do this, here are how we do it. Whereas in our world of knowledge work, where you have people who create new systems, who create new products, who are responsible for keeping services running, their actions and results and they stem from some experience. If their primary agile experience was a negative experience, they will not feel agile is for them. So lead by creating an experience that people find valuable, that they can connect with, because that will alter their beliefs, and trust their ingenuity to come up with actions and results that stem from a core agile belief system. See, our organizations are the way they are because that's what they're designed for. We may not explicitly design our systems to work the way they do, but by choices, by actions that we all take individually or collectively, we are building the organization that we are working in. And we cannot change that unless you decide to walk a different path. We can't change that by wishing that others would do it for us, you know. And in that, like, I would ask you to pay attention to the questions that you ask as you go about your day in your organization, and hopefully give yourself the time to look beyond just the event level information and try to look for some patterns and perhaps even get a glimpse of the structure of the system that leads to these events and patterns. At Evolve Agility, we help with agile transformation coaching, help teams, and have training courses that we offer. Some of my upcoming public courses are a CSPO and a Certified Agile Leadership, where we go far more in depth on the systems thinking world, to understand the role of culture, the role of management, the role of team leaders, and your role as a leader, you know, in your organization, irrespective of your position. Feel free to reach out to me or send an email, or if you have any questions now on the chat, I'm more than happy to address that.
Thank you so much, Dhaval. That was awesome. That was so awesome.